Thank you so much, Julia, Erica, and Nick, and I may have forgotten other people. It's a great, great pleasure to be here. They're wonderful, these Woolf conferences. I haven't been at all of them, but this has been a great joy. I don't want to, I don't know whether you know Nancy Mitford's biography of Evelyn Waugh. She talks about him, Evelyn Waugh's father, spending his declining years thanking people for thanking him. People have been thanking me for being at this conference, but in fact it's been a very real pleasure. I don't know about this interview. In a moment of madness, I agreed to be interviewed by my wife. We've done this before in Cambridge, and people described it as a memorable encounter. I should tell you that I don't know any of the questions that Jean is going to ask me. I hope I know some of the answers.
And you've only got about 10 minutes left. How can I be solemn now and ask him about his first memories of Virginia Woolf? But I have to, don't I? Yes. His first impression of Virginia Woolf. You were 14 when she died, and the first reference I get in the diaries to them coming to Wadston Estate, the Wadston Manor Estate, where Cecil's father was estate manager, is in 1935, when you were 8.
Yes. I think probably my old man forget, as Shakespeare says in one of the Henry plays, but not all shall be forgotten. The memory I have, I think the first memory I have, I've spoken so often about, I've been dragged out to talk about my recollections of Leonard and Virginia, and I'm always extremely apologetic that I didn't write every word down, record every word. But of course, it wasn't a big deal in those days. But to get back to Jean's question, I think probably my first recollection was leading Virginia down, and I should mention that Leonard and Virginia weren't Uncle Leonard and Aunt Virginia. They were just, unlike other uncles and Leonards and aunts in the family, they were just Leonard and Virginia. And the other thing is, they weren't a big deal. I mean, Virginia, it's important, I think, to stress that Virginia was not the megastar that she is today. We're talking about 3/4 of a century ago, when the big writers of the period were Wells and Shaw and Galsworthy. Virginia was coming into her own. She was beginning to be invited. But getting back to, sorry, I digress all the time. Getting back to Jean's question, I led Virginia down by the hand to a sort of little grotto below our house, 300 yards from the house, well, ancient sort of grotto with water in. And I remember we called each other's names. Virginia, and she called Cecil, and that's my earliest recollection of her.
And your last recollection, which you only recollected last year, and I've lived with Cecil for well, I won't tell you, you know how old I am. But his last recollection just appeared, it just popped to the surface when we were talking at the Virginia Woolf Society in Great Britain. And he said, just as he finished his talk, he said, oh yes, he said, my last view of Virginia was up an apple tree picking apples on a ladder. Isn't that lovely? So all these things actually do surface, and I keep on trying. I know you all want the memories for posterity. Now, I have another very serious question for you. Did she ever intimidate you?
I don't ever remember being afraid of Virginia Woolf. Whatever I've read in her diaries since about my side of the family, which isn't always very flattering, my actual memories of staying with Leonard and Virginia, visiting at Monk's house and 52 Tavistock Square, was that she was always kind, and people are surprised when I say how amusing she was, how funny she was, and I think it's very sad that she didn't have children herself. I mean, she was a really a very motherly sort of person. So no, the answer is I was never intimidated. I suppose later on, as I became a teenager, 13 and 14, I suppose I was slightly awed of her, but not over-awed.
And how did you feel at the news of her death? Can you remember that?
I was at school, and I look back with enormous gratitude on. I was taught, one of my teachers at Stowe School was a man called Wilson Knight, Jean Wilson Knight, who later went on to be a professor of English at, I think, at Leeds University. He would have been a colleague of Quentin Bell, a wonderful Shakespearean and Miltonian scholar and critic. And it was Wilson Knight who told me of Virginia and the last walk to the Ouse. It's very strange, I think, to look back on how death hits one hard when one's a child. I remember not just how I felt then, but at more or less well at the same time, I think, my grandmother's death, how hard it hit me. And as you get older, I think you take it in your stride.
You talked about her last walk, and of course, having written about Virginia Woolf and her walks around London, I want to know where you walked. I want to know his exact route when he walked with Auntie Virginia to the London Library. I mean, don't you envy him? Fancy walking with Virginia Woolf. He's not fair, really.
No, of course one didn't. One didn't think this is history, that in 60 or 70 years' time you'll be in the United States talking to hundreds of highly knowledgeable Woolf scholars about something as trivial as walking to the London Library with Auntie. All I can remember is what good company she was. You know, what good talk we had, and only a a few months ago, I was at the London Library at a party, and I was talking to one of the librarians, and I mentioned, she asked me about Virginia, and I mentioned walking to the London Library. All I could really remember was the librarian's name, Mr. Cox.
I asked you what your route was on the road to the London Library.
I think my route, if anybody is passionately interested in knowing what my route was almost certainly down Gower Street, the sort of obvious way you would go. But think of London as a town with about 1/10 of the population it has today. You know, we probably passed Lady Ottilien Murrell's house in Gower Street.
I'm not sure that was a complete answer. I was hoping to add a chapter to my book on Virginia walks. No. Has your sense... No. This is why I'm enjoying it so much. You have no right to reply if I've got the microphone. No, a serious question. Has your sense of Virginia Woolf evolved? I mean, that was 1941. That's over 70 years ago. Has your sense of her evolved over the years? And what do you think, or is it dangerous to ask you two questions at once? What do you think about the fictionalizations of Virginia Woolf's work? Because of course we've had many, haven't we? Vanessa and her sister, Adeline, and I could go on. What do you think? And be careful, because Maggie G's wonderful book on Virginia Woolf and New York is in the audience, so...
That's a lot of questions. You're asking me how my knowledge of Virginia Woolf. Well, first of all, I can't claim at that age. I may have read Dostoevsky, but I don't think I've read Virginia. I read her probably very shortly afterwards. I do remember 3 guineas arriving through the post from my father. I think he reviewed it in The Nation, one of those papers, and I read it then, but I don't think I read the novels. I've read the 9 novels several times since then, and yes, of course my knowledge has, and my appreciation of Virginia has evolved and developed over the years. When I first met Jean, over 50 years ago, we met in the reading room of the British Museum. In those days, I don't know how this came. Well, it must have been a question that I was asked, and I think I said that I preferred D.H. Lawrence to Virginia Woolf. The relationship survived.
Yes, I won't tell you what he said. I think the first thing he said when I said, "Are you Cecil Woolf?" because I'd read a pamphlet he'd written on an unknown writer, he said, "Do I know you?" And the relationship survived that too. But on to all matters Woolfian. You didn't answer, very tactfully didn't answer the question about fictionalization, and I won't ask you now, because I really would like to say something about Leonard, because when you were newly out of the army in 1947-48, Cecil went in right at the end. He ran away to enlist And I said, how did your mother feel? He was 16 at the time. Your mother feel? He said, oh, I don't think she was very happy. But he was in the war itself at the very end. And so when you came back in 1946-47, you went to live in Leonard's house that he had, London house that he had got after Virginia had died. And it was in Victoria Square. And so Cecil, for many years, was in the basement flat and the ground floor flat. And Duncan Grant was at the top of the house. So it was really a very lovely situation from our point of view anyway, don't you think? How did you lived with Leonard for many years and got much closer to him. What are your memories, your main memories of Leonard? You might even come up with something, dredge it up, you know?
How does one sum up somebody as many-sided as Leonard Woolf in 2 minutes? I mean, Leonard was what I suppose people call today a Renaissance man. He had a great many interests, and I got to know him really quite well in those days. He came up to London 4 or 5 days a week, but gradually as time went on, he came up less and less. When he was in his late 80s, I suppose he was coming up about one day a week to work at the press. He still carried on as reading manuscripts and taking an active part in the Hogarth Press. I hope I'm not anticipating a question when I say that one or two occasions when I was staying at Rodmell at Monk's House, it may seem strange. In those days, publishers kept in touch with booksellers personally, something that probably doesn't happen today. Sir Stanley Unwin, in his book, The Truth About Publishing, says how important, he's absolutely right, he says how important it is for publishers to keep in touch with booksellers. Well, in those days, bookselling and publishing was a very personal business, and I went with Leonard to bookshops in Brighton, which is quite close to Rodmell, and on one occasion we traipsed around the shops, Leonard getting orders. I mean, he had sales representatives, of course. He didn't rely, solely on going around himself. This was something he'd do perhaps once a year, twice a year, I suppose. He said to me, would you like something to eat? This is lunchtime. I said, yes, I'm getting a big package. And I thought we'd repair to a restaurant or cafe or somewhere. So which he went into a baker's shop and he bought 2 bread rolls and 2 pats of butter. And when he came out, he produced from his pocket a notebook, and he wrote down in pencil 2 bread rolls, 2 pence, 2 pats of butter, 1 pence. Now, I tell you this story because, not because he was mean, he wasn't. Leonard, it was a strange mixture. People always think he was very, very careful, but the story illustrates his practice of recording everything. He could be very generous and very caring, but I mustn't go on, so I'm going to anticipate other questions.
Well, we have very little time left, but I wanted to ask you, yesterday we were interviewed, or the day before, for local television, which was quite nice. And Cecil behaved himself. And of course came up with one, oh, I didn't behave myself. And came up with one of his wonderful remarks that comes up from the depths, you know. And he was talking about Leonard, and he said, oh yes, he said, I remember meeting Bertrand Russell at one of Leonard's parties. And I thought, well, how many other members of Bloomsbury or fringes of Bloomsbury did this man know? I mean, I've only been with him, as I say to you, far too many years. But I wondered, how many members of Bloomsbury did you know? I know you've told the story about T.S. Eliot having lunch with Leonard, half a pork pie and a drink of lemonade from a cracked cup. But, you know, that's another of his throwaway stories. But who else? Who else? Come on now, you're on the...
I'm not in the business of dropping names. I think I'll pass on that question because over time, of course, yes, I did meet a great many people, you know, late survivors of Bloomsbury, and those of you who were at Glasgow at the Virginia Woolf conference at Glasgow a year or two ago will remember that I talked about Duncan. Duncan had a flat at the top of Leonard's London house, and I saw a good deal of him, both in London and at Charleston. He was a delightful man. I think Duncan seemed unencumbered by baggage. He was such a lovely, open man. No guile at all. The last time, if we're talking about stories, look, I can't resist telling you, although I hope it's part of answering your question. My last memory of Duncan was running into him after what I think of as the Victoria Square. That's where Leonard's London house was in Westminster. I think of it as the diaspora when Trekkie Parsons, Trekkie and Ian had a flat in 24 Victoria Square, Duncan at the top, I was on the ground floor, and the house was, when Leonard died in 1969, the house had to be sold. A few years later, I went into Duncan in Piccadilly near Hatchard's bookshop. I didn't recognize him at first, and then I realized, hey, that's Duncan. He had hair down to his shoulders, and we talked for some time. I went to a bar and had a few, one or three glasses. And although I'm not in the practice of making personal remarks, I was well brought up. My father said to me when I was a child, never ask personal questions because it's vulgar and therefore to be avoided. But on this occasion, I eventually said to Duncan, "You've grown your hair, Duncan, what?" And he thought for a long time, and then he said, "Yes, my barber is dead."
I hope you feel sorry for me having to interview. I just wanted to end really with quite a serious question. And I know we've gone over our time, but Julie hasn't appeared to police me, so I'm going on. And I just wanted to ask Cecil something very interesting, I think, in the family, and something you will know about, is that Cecil's father was wounded by the same shell that killed his uncle Cecil, his father's favourite brother and Leonard's youngest brother. And when Philip, the father of Cecil, was convalescing in London, as you will almost certainly know, Cecil's brother Philip was in hospital. Leonard and Virginia eventually went, well, quite soon actually. Leonard went 2 days after Philip had arrived in London, wounded, and Virginia went 10 days later to see him. And her description there has led a number of people to wonder if Philip Woolf, Cecil's father, wasn't perhaps the model for the character of Septimus Smith in Mrs. Dalloway. And I mean, it's an attractive theory. I think probably flawed, because I think there are many things that don't tally there, but perhaps partly a little element to this. But I wasn't going to ask Cecil about that. It's far too personal, and one can't expect him to be objective about it. What I was going to ask him, no, we're out of time, but I did want to ask him about something you may not know, which is how much the Rothschilds, and don't forget that Philip Woolf was the estate manager on the Rothschilds estate, how much the Rothschilds contributed, and through Cecil's father mainly, contributed to helping the Jews who were escaping in large numbers from Nazi Germany in the 1930s. And I know your father was very influential in this.
Yes, my father was, he managed James de Rothschild's estate. We have a family connection actually, because my father's first cousin, Dorothy Pinto, was Jimmy Rothschild's wife. Could perhaps explain why my father got the job. Yes, the Rothschilds and my father, they worked together to get a great many, probably over 100 Jewish people out of Germany. That included an entire orphanage, and the staff of the orphanage, which, when you think of it, is a rather wonderful thing. But the only connection that I can see between your question, Dean, and Bloomsbury is that my father travelled a good deal between our home in Buckinghamshire, about 40-50 miles from London, and going up to Woburn Square to the, I think it's called the Board of Jewish Deputies, and often on his visits to them to talk about getting people into England, getting them out of Nazi Germany, I would go stroll across 300 or 400 yards to Tavistock Square and see Leonard and Virginia and enjoy myself in the...
I won't go on.